The lights in the Tokyo Budokan were merciless, white beams cutting through the early afternoon haze inside the cavernous hall. The air smelled faintly of sweat, tatami mats, and the resin of wooden beams that had soaked up decades of noise from tournaments and demonstrations. Hundreds of athletes, reporters, and students pressed forward toward the raised platform in the center. They came to watch the country's most uncompromising judo master run his seminar. He was in his 60s, stocky and severe, face weathered by years of training halls and competitions. His reputation was as sharp as the GI he wore. White, perfectly folded, belt darkened nearly to black-blue with use. For decades, his name meant discipline, precision, and absolute seriousness. He was not a man who joked, not a man who softened his words. That afternoon, he decided to prove it once again. As the room hushed, he stepped forward, microphone close enough to catch the low rasp of his voice. At first, he spoke about judo itself, the values of respect, the power of leverage, the legacy of Japanese martial tradition. Listeners nodded along. Students in crisp white uniforms sat cross-legged at the edge of the mats, their eyes wide, soaking in each word. Then, almost casually, as if it had just occurred to him, he leaned toward the reporters and let the bomb drop. "Chuck Norris," he said, his voice rising, "is a myth. Hollywood made him. On the tatami, he has nothing." The statement landed like a thrown stone. At first, there was a beat of silence, stunned more by the directness than the content. Then came laughter, bursts from the younger athletes who had grown up worshipping their teacher's bluntness. The sound spread quickly, a current through the crowd, until applause joined in, echoing against the Budokan walls. The master did not smile. He nodded once, firmly, as if confirming his own words, then raised his voice above the noise. "Cinema tricks don't work here. In real martial arts, fantasy collapses." His Japanese was sharp, clipped, and even through the translator's echo into English, the words felt like an insult carved from stone. The younger judoka in the crowd cheered louder, some even chanting his name. They wanted spectacle, and he had given them one. For them, mocking an American movie icon was proof of their art's superiority, a reaffirmation of cultural pride. For the older coaches on the sidelines, the moment landed heavier. They knew the world beyond the dojo. They knew words like these would not stay inside Japan. Reporters scribbled fast. Camera shutters snapped like insect wings. By evening, the first headlines appeared in Japanese sports sites. Judo legend calls Chuck Norris a fraud. Within hours, the English translations spread. "Norris nothing without Hollywood," says Tokyo Master. The phrasing stung. The word myth repeated itself across articles, bolded, lifted into headlines, shared on talk shows. It wasn't just a critique of a man, it was a dismissal of a legend, a denial of everything he symbolized for audiences who had grown up believing in him. In Los Angeles, an American journalist read the headline aloud in a newsroom full of chatter. A younger colleague laughed. "Guess he's been exposed." But older staffers shook their heads. They remembered the 70s and 80s, remembered the grainy broadcasts where Chuck Norris had moved through opponents with unnerving calm. They knew his name was more than Hollywood gloss. The insult sounded personal, even generational. Clips of the master's speech circulated online. Crowds in Tokyo roared approval in the footage, their laughter carrying like a challenge across the Pacific. Comment sections filled quickly. Some mocked Norris, calling him outdated, irrelevant. Others defended him fiercely, calling the Japanese master arrogant, disrespectful, blind to the fact that Norris's career had begun in real competition long before cinema lights had found him. By the second day, American sports networks picked it up. Anchors leaned into the cultural tension. A martial arts war of words, one broadcaster teased, Tokyo versus Texas. It was no longer about two men. It had become a contest of pride, tradition versus icon, East versus West. And then came the announcements. What had been planned as a modest seminar series in Tokyo was suddenly repackaged. Flyers were reprinted overnight. A demonstration match, side by side on tatami, the Judo master and Chuck Norris. Originally scheduled as a friendly cultural exchange, it was now branded as the confrontation everyone wanted. The Japanese public prepared to see their master vindicate his words. American journalists booked last-minute flights, determined to watch their old hero answer the insult. The stage was no longer local. It was global. But on that first afternoon, before the media frenzy fully exploded, one image lingered. The master standing tall, his hand slicing through the air as he declared Norris a fabrication. The crowd's laughter rising behind him. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, a man who had lived quietly, training as always, surely heard his name reduced to a joke. The insult had traveled across oceans in less than a day. The answer, everyone sensed, would not take long to follow. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, bellow. Word spread quickly that the Japanese master's remarks had reshaped the entire purpose of the event. What had been scheduled as a respectful workshop between two martial traditions was now something else entirely. Flyers were hastily redesigned, headlines reframed, a showdown of legends in Tokyo. The Budokan Arena was reserved for a single evening that promised more than just demonstrations. It promised vindication or humiliation, depending on whose side you chose. Inside Tokyo, the atmosphere was electric. Students who normally would have seen the seminar as just another training opportunity now buzzed as if they were preparing for a festival. Local newspapers printed caricatures of Chuck as a movie cowboy facing a stoic judo fighter. Television segments looped the master's harsh words, replaying the laughter of the audience that had cheered him. For the Japanese public, the expectation was clear. Their master would dismantle the American myth in front of them. Meanwhile, the arrival of American press transformed the event into something larger than sport. Journalists flew in from Los Angeles, New York, Dallas, and Chicago, many of them men and women who had grown up in the decades when Chuck's name meant grit and toughness. They came not just to observe, but to defend an era, a symbol. For them, this was no mere exhibition. It was cultural, almost personal. The day of the event, the Budokan swelled to capacity. The weather outside was unremarkable. Humid air, a gray sky. But inside, anticipation charged the air so thickly that conversations trembled. Fans waved small Japanese flags in the stands. Reporters crowded the lower levels, microphones already on, waiting to capture whatever soundbite would define the evening. Security lines moved slower than usual. Too many people, too much energy. Before the demonstrations began, the master appeared alone on the mats, greeted by thunderous applause. He raised his hands slightly, acknowledging the noise, then let it fall into silence before he spoke. His words were measured, but his intent was sharp. "Myth is fragile," he declared, his voice amplified through the speakers. "When it meets reality, it disappears. Tonight, you will see truth." The crowd erupted, stamping their feet against the floorboards. Even those who had come skeptical found themselves swept up by his authority. He didn't just promise a fight, he promised the unmasking of an illusion. From the press seats, American reporters scribbled, their faces tense. They knew the line would be broadcast instantly. Some whispered among themselves, Does Norris even care? Will he rise to this? The master began to demonstrate, almost as a preview. He threw a young student across the mat with crisp technique, his voice rising as he explained leverage and balance. Each thud of body against tatami was punctuated with commentary. This is real. This is not performance. This is discipline. He gestured toward the stands as if to remind them who his target truly was. Every throw brought applause, laughter, energy climbing higher. Then came the pause everyone had been waiting for. The announcer's voice rang out, first in Japanese, then English. Please welcome Chuck Norris. No music, no flashing lights. Just a man in a plain white GI walking down the aisle with the same calm he carried into every room. His hair was shorter than the movies remembered. His stride was steady, shoulders square, but relaxed. He bowed politely to the officials, shook hands with the event organizers, then stepped onto the mat without flourish. The crowd's energy faltered. They had expected spectacle, maybe a swagger, maybe bravado. What they saw was restraint. His silence carried its own weight, pressing against the noise that had filled the hall minutes before. The master eyed him, lips curling into the faintest trace of a smirk. He addressed the audience again. See the difference? One comes to perform, the other comes to teach. He turned deliberately toward Chuck, as though presenting him like evidence. Chuck bowed once toward him, nothing more. No retort, no grandstanding. The simplicity of it created an unexpected contrast. One man feeding the crowd's hunger, the other ignoring it entirely. For a moment, the entire hall seemed to hesitate. Students who had been clapping now sat with their hands hovering over their laps. Journalists glanced at each other, aware that something subtle had shifted. The air vibrated with anticipation, not because of what had been said, but because of what hadn't. And then, slowly, the silence spread, deeper than before. The crowd sensed the approach of something unscripted, something beyond slogans and boasts. The arena, filled with thousands, suddenly sounded like a room holding its breath. The tatami mats were firm underfoot, their faint straw scent rising whenever a foot pressed too hard. Bright lights overhead flattened every shadow, leaving no place to hide, no corner of mystery. The arena's buzz had simmered down into a nervous hum, the kind of sound that belongs to thousands of people waiting for something to crack open. The judo master was the first to move. He snapped his GI sleeves tight, squared his shoulders, and called a younger student to the mat. With a flourish, he demonstrated the classic shoulder throw. The boy lifted off the ground cleanly, body arching, then slapped the mat with practiced precision. The sound rang out crisp and final. The master straightened, looked to the crowd, and barked, "This is judo." This is real. Laughter and applause swelled immediately. He repeated the move with another student, louder this time, exaggerating the rotation, adding commentary that carried to the rafters. No tricks, no cameras. This is what strength looks like. Each slam drew more reaction, fueling him, sharpening his edge. He gestured broadly toward the American standing quietly at the edge, making sure the implication wasn't lost. Chuck remained motionless. His eyes tracked each throw, not with challenge but with the calm curiosity of a craftsman studying another trade. He bowed once toward the officials again, then stepped forward. The crowd noticed the shift instantly. The applause weakened. Hands lowered. The air thickened with the anticipation of collision. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised but forgotten, their gaze locked on the space where two men now faced each other. The master paced toward him, energy bristling. His voice boomed, pitched high to keep the crowd with him. This is the moment. Watch closely. Watch the difference between stories and reality. He reached out abruptly, gripping Chuck's right arm with iron intent, and pivoted for a clean seoi nage, the shoulder throw that had sent dozens of students flying only moments before. The motion was flawless, his grip solid, his turn sharp, his hips placed exactly where they should be. The crowd prepared itself for the thud of body against tatami. A few voices shouted prematurely, convinced they already knew the ending. But the sound never came. Chuck did not move. It was as if his feet had rooted into the mat itself. The master pulled, rotated, drove with his shoulder, yet the body before him refused to shift. No counterstrike, no visible effort. Just weight, immovable and quiet, held in place by something unseen. A hush rippled through the arena. The master's face tightened, sweat appearing where before there had been only certainty. He adjusted his stance, tried again, this time with a sharper twist, his back muscles straining, veins visible in his forearm. The GI fabric stretched taut between them. And still, Chuck remained upright, calm, balanced, as if the earth had claimed him. For the first time that evening, laughter faltered. The young athletes who had been clapping leaned forward, puzzled. Was this a mistake? A trick of timing? The silence thickened, spreading through rows of spectators like fog. Chuck's eyes stayed steady, not mocking, not triumphant, simply present. He wasn't resisting in the way one expects an opponent to resist. He wasn't countering, wasn't wrestling for leverage. He was doing nothing at all. And yet that nothing was stronger than the master's everything. The master grunted, breath sharp in the microphone. His smirk was gone. He tried to recover the moment, pushing harder, changing the angle, but his GI sleeves betrayed the effort. Creases deepening, fabric twisting. The veteran reporters in the stands knew what they were seeing. A man used to absolute control suddenly discovering the ground didn't respond to him. In the upper rows, someone shouted encouragement in Japanese, but it only highlighted the absence of sound elsewhere. The rhythm of applause was gone. Cameras still recorded, but the audience seemed reluctant to breathe, afraid of breaking the fragile, shocking stillness. And then the master released his grip, stepping back quickly, almost stumbling, his gi damp with sudden sweat. He covered the motion with a bark of laughter, waving at the crowd as if to pretend it was all part of the show. "Strong, yes," he called, forcing cheer into his voice. But the cheer he sought did not return as before. The applause was hesitant, scattered, like rain starting and stopping across rooftops. People exchanged glances. They had seen the effort, the strain, the failure to move what was supposed to be easy. Chuck remained where he was, calm as ever, his breathing even. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that could have been respect, or simply acknowledgement that the first attempt had passed. He said nothing. The master's jaw tightened. For him, silence was more dangerous than words. The crowd felt it too. What had begun as comedy was tilting into something else, something heavier. The air in the Budokan changed. No one knew what the next movement would bring, but everyone understood the rules had just shifted. The master shook his shoulders out once, a short, violent motion meant to disguise the unease crawling through his body. His jaw was set so hard the cords of his neck bulged under the lights. He clapped his hands against his thighs and barked a guttural command that snapped even the chattering students into silence. He lunged again. Same entry, only harsher. Shoulder throw, deep turn, all his weight behind it. His GI belt slapped against his ribs, fabric straining as he pulled. But the throw collapsed in his hands. Chuck shifted his stance almost imperceptibly. One heel rooted, the other rotated a fraction. That was enough. The leverage vanished. The master's force spilled forward into nothing. The arena reacted like a single organism. From the upper tiers came nervous giggles, the kind of laughter people use when they don't know how else to respond. Others gasped audibly, eyes widening, jaws half open. What had been demonstration was beginning to feel like exposure. The master tore free, breathing heavy, face bright with anger. "Yami!" he barked. "Stop!" But the word came out more like a protest than a command. He circled, pointed to the crowd, and shouted through the microphone, "Now, truly, you will see." He stormed in with combinations, no pauses, no showmanship now. A sleeve grip snapped like a whip. A collar hold cinched tight. Inside trip, then outside reap, one following the other like drumbeats. Each attempt struck clean and fast, and each met emptiness. Chuck's weight slid out of the line of attack by the breadth of a coin. A hook found no leg. A sweep found no foot. A drag met slack fabric that refused to answer back. The audience noise shifted. The students who had been laughing earlier leaned forward, chins on knees. Coaches crossed their arms, watching more seriously than they had intended. Reporters scribbled frantically, then stopped mid-sentence, realizing words were failing them. The Budokan, famous for echoes, now held a silence heavier than applause. The master drove his head under Chuck's jaw, seeking to off-balance him with pressure and rhythm. He shot for a Dayashi Barai, brushing at the foot. Chuck let his step hang in the air a heartbeat longer, and the sweep whispered past nothing. Another gasp rose from the crowd. Sweat poured down the master's temples, dripping onto the mat. He jerked hard on the collar, dragging down and then up, trying to catch Chuck between commands. But each change of direction landed on a body that seemed to anticipate before it happened. Chuck wasn't reacting. He was already there. "Move him!" someone shouted in Japanese, the plea raw. But the mat itself felt tilted, as though gravity favored only one man. The master doubled down. He dove for Tayotoshi, cutting hard across the line, hips and thighs straining with effort. For a split second, Chuck's balance tilted, and then returned, steady as a wall. The master staggered a half-step to save himself. The audience roared with a single collective gasp. A smattering of laughter followed, harsh and unkind. "Again!" he shouted, voice ragged. His gi was damp, his chest heaving. He tried kataguruma, dropped low for a leg pick, even threatened old techniques retired from competition. Each one collapsed against the same calm resistance. Chuck's stance absorbed them all, redirecting force into silence. The young athletes who had cheered earlier now sat stone still. Parents hushed their children. Phones still recorded, but fewer eyes looked at the screens. Most stared directly, unwilling to miss the live weight of it. The master gripped Chuck's collar and sleeve one last time, hands clawing at fabric, teeth clenched. His feet cut a sharp angle, preparing for the path he had trusted his entire career. His body remembered the rhythm. His muscles obeyed. The crowd leaned forward, sensing desperation wrapped in technique. Chuck's expression did not change. His center dropped half an inch, his breath steady. He looked less like a man resisting, and more like one waiting for the inevitable misstep. A bead of sweat fell from the master's chin and darkened Chuck's GI before vanishing. The small mark seemed louder than the noise in the hall. The master growled, almost to himself. "Now!" His hips turned, shoulders bent, hands pulling with every ounce left in him. He hurled his force forward, into a void he couldn't see. For the first time, his balance tilted dangerously close to collapse. The audience reacted with a long, ragged inhalation, thousands of lungs pulling in the same moment. Laughter was gone. What filled the Budokan now was a different kind of tension, the awareness that the line between display and real combat had already dissolved. The master adjusted his belt with quick, nervous hands, as though the simple act might reorder what had already unraveled. His chest rose and fell harder now. Sweat darkened the collar of his GI. He squared himself, collar grip snapping onto Chuck's lapel, his other hand locking at the sleeve. It was the hold he trusted most, the one carved into his body after a lifetime of drilling. He flexed his jaw and drew a sharp breath through his nose. The arena leaned forward, every eye locked on the familiar setup. The master's signature throw was coming, the move that had carried him through tournaments, exhibitions, a career of certainty. He pulled high on the collar, drove the sleeve across, and cut his hips low and deep. This was the rhythm he had rehearsed tens of thousands of times. For a moment, Chuck let himself rise with the pull, as though gravity had loosened its grip on him. Then, almost too quietly to notice, his weight dropped. Not a crash, not a stomp, just a slow settling of mass, a deliberate rooting into the tatami. The master felt it immediately, the invisible door closing just before he could step through. He forced harder. His shoulder rotated, legs straining, back muscles corded. The GI fabric stretched, seams squealing, but Chuck's sleeve grip softened and reformed, thumb pressing just above the hinge of the elbow, a carpenter's touch redirecting force through the joint. The collar pull no longer bent him forward. It bent itself into emptiness. The master committed anyway. His body followed the pattern burned into it since youth, hips turning, heel planted. Only this time the pattern met no cooperation. Chuck's other hand slid to the triceps, quiet, firm. His heel turned the width of a coin. The alignment shifted, tiny but absolute. The audience felt it before they saw it. A ripple of unease moved through the stands. To the untrained eye, it looked like two men locked in a dead grip. To anyone who had ever fought on tatami, the geometry was clear. One man had already lost his balance. The other was arranging where it would end. Chuck's hips crossed, smooth, unhurried, his back rising as the master's bent. Gravity tilted. The master's feet left the mat not with drama, but inevitability. The throw was not loud, not violent. It was clean. He rose into the air, body rotating in a long arc, belt twisting against his waist. For a split second, he hung there, suspended, face wide with disbelief that had no time to mask itself. His students in the first rows stared, mouths open, realizing they were watching their teacher in a place they had never imagined. Then, the fall. A flat, heavy thud as his back met tatami. The mat absorbed it with a dull sound, echoing into the rafters. His slap came late, too late. Pride had slowed his reflex, and the crowd heard it. A single collective inhale filled the Budokan, the sound of thousands of lungs dragging in shock at once. The silence afterward was deafening. Cameras still rolled, but even their shutters seemed to hesitate, as though embarrassed to intrude. Chuck released the GI, letting the sleeve fall limp. He stepped back exactly one pace, resetting his feet in the same calm stance he had begun with. His breathing was steady, slower now, as if nothing had happened. He didn't raise his arms, didn't nod to the crowd. He stood as though the throw had been an ordinary movement, a correction of balance, nothing more. On the mat, the master stared upward, chest heaving, jaw twisted askew. He blinked at the lights, tasting the metallic tang of exertion. Nothing in him was broken, except certainty. He rolled to a hip, propped himself on a hand, then sat upright. His eyes found Chuck's feet, then traveled upward. There was no gloating waiting for him, only presence. only stillness. Scattered applause began. Light, hesitant, almost inappropriate. Then more joined. It spread unevenly, like raindrops starting on a roof, until the sound filled the hall. But it wasn't the cheer of victory. It was heavier, slower. Respect, not excitement. Chuck inclined his head once, a gesture almost invisible. But in the silence, it felt like a closing bracket to the moment. The master's chin dipped back, tiny, an acknowledgement that contained both defeat and understanding. He touched his belt again, aligning it out of habit, and stood, legs trembling but firm. The students who had cheered loudest earlier now bowed their heads, quiet, unsure how to process what they had seen. American journalists scribbled frantic notes, knowing they had witnessed something beyond spectacle. The Japanese crowd, proud and stunned, absorbed the reality. Their master had attacked with everything, and the myth they had mocked had not just endured, it had answered. Chuck didn't move closer. He didn't step away. He waited, hands loose, breathing calm, while the ovation gathered strength around them. The master, still catching his breath, lifted his chin once more. His hand hovered at his side, as if debating whether to extend it. The crowd hushed again, sensing what might follow. And into that silence, the night poised itself for its final act. The master stayed down longer than anyone expected. His palms pressed flat to the tatami, arms locked, as though he needed the mat itself to convince him he was still grounded. Each breath dragged in, audible through the collar microphone, rasping in a way that betrayed how much he had poured out in that last attempt. Around him, the crowd's applause swelled and softened in uneven waves. Not the roar of triumph, but the collective sound of people acknowledging they had witnessed something beyond sport. When at last he lifted his gaze, it landed on the man standing across from him. Chuck had not moved since the throw ended. His feet were set where they had begun, his shoulders level, his eyes calm. There was no exultation in his face, no smirk, only the same composure he had carried into the hall, as though he had simply restored balance to a tilted room. That stillness pressed heavier than any celebration could have. The master braced one knee under him, then the other. His gi clung damp to his skin. The lines at the corners of his eyes deepened with effort, but his back stayed straight as he rose. He tugged at the belt ends, habit stronger than fatigue, aligning them even though nothing in his body yet felt aligned. His students in the front rows leaned forward unconsciously, as if willing their teacher back onto his feet could erase what they had just seen. Chuck stepped forward a single pace, enough to close the distance without closing it entirely. His hand opened, palm level, fingers steady. It was not a gesture of dominance. It was an invitation, a reminder that what had just happened was not about humiliation, but recognition. For a moment, the master froze. Pride quivered inside him, pride and anger, the voices of decades telling him to stand alone. Then, almost reluctantly but with the clarity of someone who understood what mattered most, he reached out. Chuck's grip met his, firm but not crushing, a handshake that was more like an anchor. The master rose fully, pulled not into submission but back into dignity. The hall erupted. Applause rolled over the rafters like weather, heavy and sustained. It wasn't frantic cheering. It was deliberate, slow, measured, as if each clap was a stone being laid into a foundation. Coaches in suits bowed their heads as they clapped. Young students clapped with wide eyes, realizing they were applauding not just one man, but the meaning of the exchange itself. When the noise softened again, Chuck spoke. He didn't raise his voice to command the hall, but the quiet carried his words as if the entire building leaned in to hear. "Stories don't live this long unless there's truth inside them," he said. "And truth doesn't come from noise. It comes from discipline, from respect." The translation came seconds later, flat in comparison. But the meaning had already landed. Heads nodded. A few in the crowd bowed without realizing they had. The sentence hung in the air like incense, seeping into corners, unshakable. The master lowered his head, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. He turned toward his students, their white uniforms stark under the lights, and raised his hand. They all stood at once, hundreds rising as though connected by a string. Together, they bowed to the tatami, their fabric whispering in unison. The sound was softer than applause, but struck deeper, a ritual older than spectacle. Chuck bowed back, not to the students, not even to the master, but to the mat itself, the space where truth had revealed itself. It was a gesture so subtle most cameras missed it, but the people who trained on tatami understood. That bow would linger longer in their memory than the throw. As he turned toward the aisle, the master walked with him for 3 paces, then stopped where tradition asked him to. He said something too quiet for microphones, a private sentence that stayed between them. Chuck's eyes softened in response, the kind of reply that required no words. Then he continued toward the tunnel, his stride unhurried, as if nothing in him had changed, though everything around him had. The ovation followed him to the edge of the hall. It didn't chase, it accompanied. By the time he disappeared into the corridor, the sound was still growing. People on their feet, some wiping their eyes, others gripping the shoulders of friends without knowing why. On the tatami, the master stood alone again. His breath had steadied. His chest no longer heaved. He looked at the place where he had fallen and pressed his toe against the seam of the mat, as if testing whether the ground was still honest. It was. He allowed himself one long exhale, eyes closing briefly, before facing his students again. They bowed once more. This time, they weren't bowing to tradition, or even to him. They were bowing to what they had seen, the collision of myth and truth, and the discovery that they weren't opposites at all. Outside, the humid Tokyo night clung to the street, but people leaving the Budokan carried themselves differently. A father told his son, "Remember the throw." After a pause, softer, "And remember the hand." The boy nodded, eyes wide, committing both to memory. Inside the hall, the applause finally broke, leaving behind a silence that wasn't empty, but full. A silence that said the lesson had been given, and would not be forgotten.